The summons, the air in the New York City headquarters of the NAACP, was a frantic symphony of ringing telephones, the clatter of typewriter keys, and the urgent hum of purpose. In the heart of this controlled chaos sat Thurgood Marshall, a man who seemed to exist in his own pocket of profound stillness. His desk was an island of meticulous order in a sea of paper. Stacks of files, each a testament to a life hanging in the balance, stood like skyscrapers on his desk. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was an architect of hope, a cartographer charting paths to justice through a wilderness of hate. His focus was absolute. His mind a finely tuned legal machine processing facts, precedents, and the weight of human suffering, with equal, unwavering precision. He was deep into the appeal of a sharecropper in Mississippi when his senior partner, Walter White, appeared at his door, his expression grim. "Thurgood," he said, his voice low, "I need you." Marshall looked up, his concentration broken. He followed White into his cavernous office, where a telegram lay on the polished mahogany desk like a death notice. "It's from Alabama," White said, pushing the telegram forward. "A little town called Liberty Creek. I'd be surprised if you've ever heard of it." Marshall read the flimsy paper. The words were stark, desperate. A black farmer, Elias Vance, accused of robbery and assault against a white shop owner. The local NAACP chapter, a small, brave group of 3, was terrified. The trial was in 2 weeks. A conviction was a certainty. In 1940s Alabama, an accusation of a black man assaulting a white man was a public invitation to a lynching, with the trial serving as a mere formality. "It's a slaughterhouse, Thurgood," White said, his voice heavy. "They don't want a lawyer, they want a miracle worker. This isn't one of our test cases. There's no grand constitutional principle at stake. It's just one man, one family, against a town that's already decided he's guilty." "One man is always the grandest constitutional principle," Marshall replied, his voice quiet but firm. He felt the familiar pull, the righteous anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. He thought of his own close call years ago in Tennessee, of the lynch mob that had almost succeeded. He knew what awaited him. The narrative thread then spun south, weaving itself into the fabric of Liberty Creek. Here, the world was smaller, slower, and infinitely more dangerous. Elias Vance's farm wasn't a grand estate. It was 10 acres of stubborn red clay that he and his wife, Sarah, had coaxed into life. Their home was a simple, whitewashed house, filled with the scent of baked bread and the sound of their 6-year-old son, Jacob, playing with wooden soldiers on the porch. This was their world, a small, fiercely protected pocket of love and dignity in a society that afforded them none. The nightmare had descended on a Tuesday. Elias had gone into town to dispute a bill with Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the local mercantile. An hour later, the sheriff arrived, his face set like stone, and dragged Elias away in front of his crying wife and confused son. The charge was robbery and assault. Abernathy claimed Elias had stolen $20 and, when confronted, had shoved him to the ground, injuring his wrist. It was a lie, a venomous fiction spun from a simple disagreement. But in Liberty Creek, Abernathy's word was gospel, and Elias's was worth less than the dust on the road. Now their small world was shrinking, suffocating them. Neighbors they had known their whole lives crossed the street to avoid Sarah's gaze. The silence from their white neighbors was louder than any accusation. The farm, their life's work, their legacy for Jacob, was poised to be swallowed whole by the coming storm. Days later, Thurgood Marshall boarded a train heading south. The journey was a descent, a peeling back of the thin veneer of progress. He started in a comfortable, integrated car, reading his law books as the New York skyline faded. But as the train plunged deeper into the country, across the Mason-Dixon line, the rules changed. A conductor, his voice polite but unyielding, informed him he would have to move. Marshall walked the length of the train to the colored car, a cramped, poorly maintained carriage at the very front, where the smoke and soot from the engine billowed in through the cracked windows. He stared out at the passing landscape, the palmy, lush, green fields of Virginia giving way to the starker pines of the Carolinas, and finally, the blood-red clay of Alabama. The beauty of the land was a cruel irony, a beautiful mask hiding an ugly truth. With every mile, the air grew thicker, heavier, saturated with a history of violence and fear. When he finally stepped off the train in Liberty Creek, the station was deserted. The sun beat down with a punishing intensity. The silence was absolute, profound, and deeply unwelcoming. This wasn't just a town, it was a fortress, and he had just walked through the gates, alone. Chapter 2. The Wall of Hostility. The Liberty Creek Jail was a squat brick building that seemed to sweat in the Alabama heat. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and despair. Marshall was led by a silent deputy to a row of segregated cells in the basement. There, in the dim light filtering through a single grimy window, sat Elias Vance. He was a shell of the man Sarah had described. His broad shoulders were slumped, his face etched with a fear so deep it seemed to have aged him a decade. "Mr. Vance," Marshall said, his voice echoing in the stone corridor. "My name is Thurgood Marshall. The NAACP sent me." Elias looked up, his eyes hollow. Hope was a language he had forgotten how to speak. Marshall pulled a small stool to the bars of the cell and sat. He didn't promise victory or offer platitudes. He simply listened. For over an hour, Elias spoke in a low, broken voice, recounting the events of that Tuesday. He spoke of the dispute over the overpriced seed, of Abernathy's condescending tone, of the lie that had been spun from a simple act of standing up for himself. He had not stolen a penny. He had not laid a hand on the man. He just hates us, Elias whispered, his voice cracking. Hates that we have our own land. Hates that I don't call him sir every time I see him. This ain't about no $20. Marshall listened, absorbing every detail, every tremor in Elias's voice. He saw the truth in the man's eyes, the deep, abiding decency that the town had mistaken for weakness. "I believe you, Mr. Vance," Marshall said when he had finished. And in those 4 words, a flicker of light returned to Elias's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Leaving the jail, Marshall began his own investigation and quickly discovered that the bars of Elias's cell extended invisibly throughout the entire town. Liberty Creek was a closed loop, a conspiracy of silence. When he approached white residents who might have been near the mercantile that day, doors were slammed in his face. Polite inquiries were met with cold stares or muttered threats. He went to the sheriff's office to request the official report, only to have the sheriff, a beefy man with a toothpick planted in the corner of his mouth, lean back in his chair and laugh. "Report? The report is, he did it. Trial's in 2 weeks. You best be on the train home before then, son. This town don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." The wall of hostility was seamless. One afternoon, seeking a cup of coffee, Marshall walked past the town's only diner. Through the large window, he saw Judge Beaumont, his face stern even in relaxation, sharing a slice of pie with Silas Blackwood, the prosecutor. They were laughing, their heads close together, the picture of comfortable, unchecked power. As Marshall watched, Blackwood looked up and their eyes met through the glass. The laughter died on Blackwood's lips, replaced by a look of pure, venomous contempt. A few minutes later, Blackwood exited the diner and approached Marshall on the sidewalk. He was tall and imposing, and he moved with the predatory grace of a man who had never been told no. "Marshall," he said, his voice a low drawl, "I hear you're down here to represent our boy. Let me give you some friendly advice. We have a way of doing things in Liberty Creek. Justice is swift, efficient. I'd hate to see a fancy lawyer from New York get himself all tangled up in our local customs." The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in the thin veil of Southern civility. "The only custom I'm interested in, Mr. Blackwood," Marshall replied, his voice level, is the one outlined in the United States Constitution. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. That book ain't got much jurisdiction in this town, he hissed, before turning and walking away. That evening, dejected and weary, Marshall found his only allies. He took a room in the modest home of Reverend Thomas, the elderly, stoop-shouldered pastor of the local AME Zion Church. The preacher and his wife welcomed him with quiet dignity, offering him a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. They own this town, Mr. Marshall, Reverend Thomas said, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The judge, the sheriff, Blackwood, they're all cut from the same cloth. They mean to make an example of Elias. He paused, his gaze steady. But that boy is a good man. He's a deacon in my church. He's honest to a fault. That's why Abernathy hates him. A black man with dignity is the most dangerous thing in the world to a man like Abernathy. The preacher's words solidified what Marshall already knew. This wasn't a case. It was a war, and he was standing on the front line. The fortress of lies. The day of the trial dawned heavy and grey, the sky a perfect mirror of the mood in Liberty Creek's black community. The courtroom was a theatre of prejudice. The wood of the benches was worn smooth by generations of injustice. Thurgood Marshall, dressed in a perfectly pressed dark suit, stood in stark contrast to the casual, confident air of the prosecution. Silas Blackwood roamed the room as if he owned it, which, in a sense, he did. The proceedings began with jury selection, a process Blackwood orchestrated with the cynical skill of a puppeteer. The county's voter rolls produced a handful of potential black jurors, but none of them stood a chance. Blackwood used his peremptory challenges to dismiss them one by one, offering flimsy, insulting excuses that Judge Beaumont accepted with a bored wave of his hand. This juror seems inattentive. This one's posture suggests a lack of respect for the court. Within an hour, a jury of 12 white men, shopkeepers, farmers, and clerks, all of them peers of Mr. Abernathy, was seated. They stared at Elias, Vance with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Blackwood launched his case with a flourish. His opening statement was a masterpiece of manipulative rhetoric, painting Liberty Creek as a peaceful haven threatened by an undercurrent of black criminality, with Elias Vance as its face. He then called his star witness, Mr. Abernathy. The shop owner, his arm now in a dramatic sling, hobbled to the stand. He recounted his story with tearful, righteous indignation. He spoke of Elias entering his store, angry and belligerent. He claimed Elias had demanded money, and when he refused, Elias had flown into a rage, snatching $20 from the open register and shoving him violently to the floor. "I heard my wrist snap," Abernathy cried, his voice breaking as he looked toward the jury. "He stood over me, like an animal." It was a devastating performance. Marshall watched the jury. They were captivated, their faces hardened with anger toward his client. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Marshall approached Abernathy with a calm, almost gentle demeanor. "Mr. Abernathy," he began, "you must have been terrified." "I was," Abernathy said, his voice trembling. "I feared for my life." Marshall nodded, sympathetically. Then, his tone shifted, becoming more precise. "You say the altercation happened inside your store?" "Yes, right at the counter." "And you were shoved to the floor?" "That's right." Viciously. Marshall paused. "That's interesting, because the sheriff's initial report mentions scuff marks and an overturned trash can on the sidewalk just outside your door. It mentions nothing about a disturbance inside. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Abernathy blinked, caught off guard. "Well, it all happened so fast. Maybe it was outside." Blackwood shot to his feet. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Judge Beaumont grunted. "Watch yourself, Mr. Marshall." Marshall had drawn first blood, a tiny scratch, but a scratch nonetheless. He then called into question the time of the incident, Abernathy's history of poor eyesight, and the dim lighting in the store. But Abernathy, coached by Blackwood, held firm to his central accusation. Then came the hammer blow. Blackwood called a surprise corroborating witness. a farmer named Jedediah Smith, who claimed to have been across the street that evening. Smith, a man with pale, shifty eyes, testified that he saw Elias Vance running out of the store. "He looked wild," Smith said. "Stuffed something in his pocket and ran off down the alley. I saw it clear as day." This new testimony was a body blow. It transformed Abernathy's story from one man's word against another into a seemingly verified fact. The fortress of lies now had a second guard tower. When Marshall cross-examined Smith, he was again met with practiced certainty. Smith repeated his story without deviation. Marshall, however, focused on the geography. "You were across the street, Mr. Smith." "That's right." "In front of the bakery?" "Yes." "And from that vantage point, you could see directly into Mr. Abernathy's store?" "No, not into the store, but I saw him run out, clear as day." Marshall made a small note on his legal pad. He asked a few more questions about the time and the lighting, receiving the same confident answers. As he walked back to his table, the atmosphere in the court was thick with impending doom. Blackwood leaned back, a triumphant smirk on his face. The prosecution rested. Elias Vance looked at Marshall, his eyes pleading, but Marshall's face was a mask of unreadable calm. To everyone in the room, it looked like the end. The scholar and the wife. That night, Liberty Creek slept under a blanket of stars, oblivious to the quiet war being waged in the cramped study of Reverend Thomas's home. While the town rested, Thurgood Marshall worked. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. The room was illuminated by a single, low-wattage bulb, casting long shadows across the walls. Before him, spread across the small wooden desk, were the law books he had carried with him from New York. Heavy, leather-bound volumes that were both his shield and his sword. He wasn't searching for a loophole. He was searching for a principle. His mind sifted through hundreds of cases, through the dense, archaic language of the law, looking for a truth that could cut through the lies he'd heard in court that day. He reread the trial transcripts he'd meticulously transcribed by hand, the words of Abernathy and Smith burning in his mind. And then, in the deep quiet of 3 a.m., he found it. Patterson v. Alabama. A recent state Supreme Court ruling he had vaguely remembered. As he read the court's opinion, his exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of intellectual electricity. The ruling was clear. Eyewitness testimony could be thrown out if the conditions for identification were fundamentally unreliable. It spoke of distance, lighting, and external distractions. It was a shield forged by the state's own highest court, and it was as if it had been written specifically for Elias Vance. Marshall felt the thrill of the hunt, the pure academic joy of finding the perfect legal weapon. As the sun began to rise, there was a soft knock on the study door. It was Sarah Vance. Her face was drawn with worry, but her eyes held a fierce, determined light. She had refused to be a passive spectator in the fight for her husband's life. While Marshall had been battling in the courtroom, she had been on her own mission, navigating the whispers and fears of the black community. "Mr. Marshall," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, clutching a small worn Bible to her chest. "I know I shouldn't bother you, but I was talking to some folks down by the rail yard." She explained that people were too scared to talk to a lawyer from New York, but they would talk to her, Elias's wife. An old woman had mentioned the trains. Specifically, she'd mentioned Franklin Cobb, the railroad signalman. Mr. Cobb was known for two things: his unwavering punctuality and the meticulous, almost obsessive detail of the logbook he was required to keep. "She said Mr. Cobb lives by that book," Sarah said, her words coming faster now. "He writes down every train, every delay, every single thing that happens on his shift. People say he knows what time a bird lands on the tracks." Marshall looked at Sarah, a deep, profound respect dawning in his eyes. He had been so focused on the law, on the grand principles, that he had overlooked the power of community, of a wife's love. Sarah hadn't found a legal precedent, but she had found something just as powerful, an unshakable fact: the logbook. It was the key. It was the tangible proof that could shatter the clear-as-day testimony of Silas Blackwood's witnesses. "Mrs. Vance," Marshall said, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "You may have just saved your husband's life." A new alliance was forged in that small study, a partnership between the brilliant legal scholar from the north and the determined, resourceful wife from the heart of the south. When court resumed that morning, a new energy crackled in the air. Marshall rose, and instead of calling a witness, he addressed the bench. He laid out the Patterson versus Alabama precedent with surgical precision, quoting the ruling from memory. He connected it directly to the unreliable testimony the jury had heard the day before. Judge Beaumont, who had been expecting a morning of feeble defense arguments, was visibly stunned into silence. Silas Blackwood scrambled to his feet, objecting furiously, but he was out of his depth. He hadn't read the case. He didn't understand the argument. He was a brawler, and Marshall had just challenged him to a duel of intellect. And on the basis of this precedent, Marshall concluded, his voice ringing with newfound authority, "I intend to call a rebuttal witness to challenge the very conditions of the observation Mr. Smith and Mr. Abernathy testified to." "Proceed," Judge Beaumont said, his voice laced with a new, grudging respect. "The defense calls Mr. Franklin Cobb to the stand." The train of truth. The calling of Franklin Cobb's name sent a ripple of confusion through the courtroom. He was an old man, his back bent from a lifetime of labor, but his eyes were sharp as he took the stand. He placed a thick, leather-bound logbook on the witness box, with the reverence of a priest placing a Bible on the altar. This chapter of the trial belonged to Thurgood Marshall, and he conducted it like a master symphony conductor. He began not with Abernathy, but with the corroborating witness, Jedediah Smith. Marshall had Smith recalled to the stand, where the farmer sat with a renewed, almost smug confidence. "Mr. Smith," Marshall began, "you testified that you were standing in front of the bakery. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you saw Mr. Vance run out of the mercantile?" "Clear as day," Smith repeated, the phrase now a nervous tick. Marshall walked over to Franklin Cobb. "Mr. Cobb, could you please consult your logbook for the evening in question? Tell the court if anything of note happened between 7:15 and 7:20 p.m. Mr. Cobb ran a gnarled finger down the page. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice clear and steady. "The 7:17 p.m. freight train passed through, heading north, right on schedule." Marshall turned back to Smith. "A freight train, Mr. Smith. They're quite large, are they not? And loud?" "I suppose so," Smith mumbled, his confidence beginning to fray. "And they have a powerful headlamp, do they not? A light bright enough to blind a man for a moment." "Objection!" Blackwood roared. "Counsel is leading the witness." "I'll rephrase," Marshall said smoothly, not waiting for the judge. He then produced a hand-drawn map of the town's main street, which he had spent an hour perfecting the night before. He submitted it as a defense exhibit, and after a brief, losing argument from Blackwood, Judge Beaumont allowed it. Marshall walked Smith through the map, establishing the location of the mercantile, the bakery, and the railroad tracks that ran directly behind the mercantile. The geometry was undeniable. The bakery, where Smith claimed to be standing, was on the opposite side of the tracks from the front of the mercantile. "So, Mr. Smith," Marshall said, his voice quiet, "for you to have seen Mr. Vance exit the store, you would have had to have been looking directly into the blinding headlight of a passing freight train, through the train itself, to see the front door on the other side. Is that your testimony?" The courtroom was silent. Smith's face turned pale. The lie was exposed, caught in the simple, irrefutable logic of geography and light. He began to stammer. It was dark. I might have been mistaken on the time." "Or, were you mistaken about being there at all, Mr. Smith?" Marshall pressed, his voice like steel. Smith crumbled. "I wasn't sure," he confessed, his voice a pathetic squeak. "Abernathy said he'd help me out with my loan if I backed him up. I didn't see nothing." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Blackwood slammed his fist on his table in fury. One of his 2 pillars had just turned to dust. Now, Marshall turned his attention to the main tower. "The defense recalls Mr. Abernathy," The shop owner returned to the stand, his face a mask of sweat and fear. The sling on his arm now looked less like a mark of injury and more like a cheap prop. Marshall began his final assault. He was no longer the calm, deferential lawyer. He was a prosecutor, putting the lie itself on trial. He built his case piece by piece. The darkness of the street, the 50-yard distance, the precedent of Patterson versus Alabama. And now, the train. "So, Mr. Abernathy," Marshall boomed, his voice filling the room. "You, a man with failing eyesight, claim you positively identified my client from 50 yards away, on a poorly lit street, at the exact moment a freight train was passing, creating noise and a blinding light. Is that the story you want this jury to believe?" Abernathy looked desperately toward Blackwood, but the prosecutor could only stare back, helpless. He looked at the judge, who was watching him with cold, unforgiving eyes. "You didn't just lie about the identification, did you, Mr. Abernathy?" Marshall continued, moving closer. "You lied about the assault. You lied about your injury. You lied about everything. He was disrespectful," Abernathy suddenly screamed, his composure shattering completely. The venom he'd hidden behind a mask of victimhood came pouring out. "He came into my store and argued with me, a black man arguing with me about a price, in front of other customers. He needed to be taught a lesson." The confession, raw and hateful, hung in the air, more damning than any piece of evidence. He had not confessed to a lie, but to a motive rooted in pure, malignant racism. He had sought to destroy a man's life over a perceived slight to his racial pride. Silas Blackwood sank into his chair, his face ashen. His airtight case, his fortress of lies, had been demolished, stone by stone, until nothing remained but the ugly truth. The echo of justice, the jury, which had been seated with such prejudiced certainty, returned in less than 10 minutes. Their faces were grim, not with anger at the defendant, but with the shame of having been so easily duped. The foreman, a stern-faced farmer, stood and looked directly at Thurgood Marshall. "On the charge of robbery and assault," he announced, his voice ringing with clarity, "we the jury find the defendant, Elias Vance, not guilty." A collective sigh of relief swept through the small group of black spectators. Sarah Vance collapsed into her husband's arms, her sobs of terror finally turning into tears of joy. Elias held her, his own tears streaming down his face as he looked at Thurgood Marshall, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. The Vances were a family again, saved from the brink of annihilation. The courtroom descended into a low buzz of conversation as people began to file out. Marshall calmly packed his briefcase. He felt no elation, only a weary sense of purpose fulfilled. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a wrong that had been righted, a wound that had been stitched closed. As he exited the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Silas Blackwood cornered him near the bottom of the steps. The prosecutor's face was a twisted mask of fury and humiliation. "You think you're clever, don't you, boy?" he spat, his voice low and shaking with rage. "Coming down here with your fancy books and your city tricks. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've done." Marshall stopped and faced him. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He looked at the defeated man with a gaze that was cold, clear, and utterly unflinching. "I know exactly what I've done, Mr. Blackwood," Marshall said, his voice even. "I've used the law of the state of Alabama to secure justice in a court of law. The Constitution applies here in Liberty Creek, just as it applies in New York City. You and your friends would do well to remember that. Because men like me, we're not going away." He left Blackwood standing there, speechless and morally disarmed, a relic raging against a future he could not stop. As Marshall prepared to walk to the train station, he saw Judge Beaumont descending the courthouse steps. The two men paused, their eyes meeting across the town square. There was no animosity in the judge's gaze now, only a complex mixture of shock, bewilderment, and a deep, undeniable respect. He had witnessed a master at work and had been forced, To preside over the dismantling of his own prejudiced world, he gave Marshall a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. Marshall's final meeting was with the Vance family at the edge of town. Elias tried to offer him money, the few crumpled dollars he had, but Marshall gently refused. "Your freedom is the only payment I require," he said. He knelt down and looked young Jacob in the eye. "Your father is a brave man. Be proud of him." On the train ride north, sitting in the same segregated car he had arrived in, Marshall looked out the window. The red clay of Alabama slowly gave way to the greener pastures of the north. He thought about the victory, not as an end, but as a beginning. Justice in Liberty Creek hadn't been a gift from a benevolent system. It had been taken. It had been seized through relentless preparation, intellectual rigor, and unwavering courage. It was one small town, one good man, one brutal fight. But for Thurgood Marshall, it was another vital lesson learned, another weapon sharpened for the great war ahead. Each case like this was a single, powerful echo, joining a rising chorus of justice that would one day grow strong enough to shake the foundations of the nation and earn him a seat on its highest court. The journey was long, but in the quiet click-clack of the train wheels, he could hear the sound of progress, however slow, however hard-won.